Inside a low-lit gallery at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, there is a display case most visitors walk past without slowing. It sits among heavier attractions, the bombers hanging overhead, the fuselages of aircraft that changed the shape of the 20th century, and next to those steel giants the case looks almost domestic. A wooden cabinet with glass doors, a shelf of small silver cups arranged in tidy rows, a single bottle of cognac, dark amber, unopened, its label yellowed by the years it has spent waiting. Step closer, and the arithmetic of the case begins to speak. 80 silver goblets, each of them etched with a name, each of them etched twice, in fact. Once so the name reads correctly when the cup stands upright, and again in mirror image, so the name reads correctly when the cup is turned upside down. It is a small engineering detail, but it is the whole meaning of the object. These goblets were designed to be inverted. They were designed for the moment when their owners would no longer be there to lift them. Most of the cups in the case are already upside down. There are only a handful still standing right side up, and even those, by the time a visitor is likely to be reading the little placard, belong to men long dead. The final cup was turned on a spring day in 2019. The bottle of cognac, a bottle of 1896 Hennessy, bottled in the year James Harold Doolittle was born, was uncorked once, ceremonially, on the evening of November 9th, 2013, in this very museum, and then set back on the shelf where it still sits. What is left inside it is not for drinking. What is left inside it is for remembering. To understand the case, you have to understand the ritual it was built for. Once a year, for nearly 7 decades, a shrinking circle of American airmen gathered in one American city or another, Tucson, Dayton, Charleston, Columbia, Fort Walton Beach, and put on their dress uniforms and stood around a table on which these 80 cups had been arranged. Every name was read aloud. When the reader came to a name whose owner had died in the year past, someone stepped forward, lifted the cup by its base and turned it. The reversed engraving swung into view. Whiskey or brandy, or sometimes simply water, was poured into the cups of the living, and a toast was offered, to those who had gone, to those still present, to a mission that had taken all of them once and would, in a way, keep taking them for the rest of their lives. The ritual was not a celebration. It never had been. Watch the old footage. The men in their 80s, their 90s, walking with canes, pausing to steady themselves on the edge of the table, and there is nothing triumphant in their faces. It is a vigil, year after year, cup after cup. And behind the ceremony, behind the tidiness of the case, and the polite click of a goblet being set back down, there is a question that most Americans, even most Americans who think they know this story, have never quite thought to ask. Who were the 80 men whose names are engraved on those cups? And what actually happened to them after the 18th of April 1942? Everyone knows the first half of the answer. The Doolittle Raid has become one of the most retold episodes of the Second World War. A set piece, taught in schools, dramatized in films, invoked whenever an American speaker needs a shorthand for audacity. 16 twin-engine bombers thundering off the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier. Tokyo in daylight, from 400 feet. Doolittle himself, small and grey and terrifyingly calm at the controls of the lead plane. It is a story shaped like a fist, and it usually ends with a fist landing. But the fist landing is not the end. It is barely the middle. Of the 80 men who took off from the deck of the USS Hornet that morning, 3 would be dead within hours of the raid's conclusion. 8 would fall into Japanese hands. Of those 8, 3 would be executed by firing squad on the outskirts of Shanghai in October of that same year. A 4th would die, slowly and cruelly, of malnutrition and neglect in a Japanese cell. 69 would find their way out, most of them scattered across the mountains and rice paddies of occupied China, most of them alive today only because Chinese peasants, fishermen, priests and guerrillas hid them, fed them, carried them, and, in a great many cases, died for them. That last part, the Chinese part, is where the received story breaks down entirely. Because in the weeks and months following the raid, the Japanese Imperial Army swept through the coastal provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi in a punitive campaign whose specific, Stated purpose was to make Chinese civilians pay for the assistance they had rendered to the American flyers. The best historical estimates place the death toll of that reprisal at roughly 250,000 Chinese men, women and children. It is a number that dwarfs the physical damage the Doolittle Raid inflicted on Japan by orders of magnitude, dwarfs it so thoroughly that the moral arithmetic becomes almost impossible to hold in the mind. For most of the 20th century that arithmetic was not held in the American mind at all. The story that got told and retold and told again was the American story. The launch, the strike, the impossible morale-lifting audacity of it. The rest, the executions, the escape, the vast Chinese sacrifice, the ritual of the cups and the bottle, either sat in footnotes or sat nowhere at all. The men themselves knew. That is the thing about the case in Dayton. Every one of them lived for the rest of his life with what came after the raid. The cups were not commissioned by strangers. The ceremony was not written by publicists. It was built, from the inside, by men who understood that the mission had not ended when they crossed the Japanese coastline outbound. For them, it had begun there. And so the natural place to start is not with the goblets, but with the day the goblets were made necessary. The day 16 airplanes lifted off a carrier deck at the edge of a hostile ocean and flew, without a return route, into the country that had struck Pearl Harbor 4 months earlier. Begin then, in the winter of that year. In January of 1942, the war the United States had entered was not yet a war the United States was winning. The word did not even fit. 6 weeks after the Japanese strike on the Hawaiian anchorage, the Pacific was a map of American disasters. The battleship line at Pearl was silt and oil slicks. Guam had fallen. Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces had retreated onto the Bataan Peninsula, were falling in slow motion, one ridge at a time. Singapore, the crown of British power in Asia, would surrender in February. Newspapers in New York and Chicago carried maps peppered with Japanese flags marching south and west across the ocean, and there was, from any honest reader's point of view, nothing to put in the paper to contradict them. Into that atmosphere came a proposal from a submarine officer at the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, and a plan drawn up in Washington, and finally an order sent down the chain to a mustachioed Army Air Forces officer named James Harold Doolittle, a man in his mid-40s who had spent the 1920s and 30s as one of America's most celebrated aviators, a racer, a stunt flyer, a doctor of aeronautics from MIT, a man who thought about airplanes the way engineers think about bridges. Doolittle was pulled out of a desk job and told, in effect, to figure out how to bomb Tokyo. The problem was geography. American land-based bombers could not reach Japan from any airfield the United States controlled. The nearest Allied bases were in China, and China was itself half swallowed by Japanese occupation. Aircraft carriers could theoretically approach close enough, but the Navy's own carrier-based aircraft did not have the range or the payload to reach Japan and return, and no full-sized army bomber had ever taken off from a carrier deck. There was no procedure, there was no precedent, there was on paper no aircraft that could do it. Doolittle chose the North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine, medium bomber, workhorse-sized, with a wingspan just narrow enough that, with careful positioning, it might clear a carrier's superstructure at takeoff. It could not, however, land on a carrier. It was too heavy, too fast on approach, without an arresting hook, and the flight deck was not long enough to catch it. That fact was baked into the plan from the first sketches. The B-25s would launch from a carrier, and they would not come back to a carrier. They would fly on, past the Japanese home islands, across the East China Sea, and hope to reach airfields held by Chinese nationalist forces on the mainland. Airfields that would need to be prepared and lit and staffed by allies who could not, for security reasons, be told the full details of what was coming. It was in the most literal sense a one-way mission. Doolittle understood this and said so. He said it plainly to the men he began to recruit in February and March of 1942 at Eaglin Field on the panhandle of Florida, where B-25 crews were suddenly and mysteriously required to practice short-field takeoffs on painted lines that mimicked the deck of a carrier they were not told they would ever see. He assembled his crews from the 17th Bombardment Group and its associated squadrons, young men in their 20s mostly, some barely out of flight school, a few older sergeants with the calm of the pre-war regular army. He told them the mission was dangerous, the destination classified, the odds of return not favourable. He told them any man who wanted to withdraw could withdraw without penalty and without record. No one withdrew. There were 80 of them, all told, when the crews were finalised. 5 men to a B-25, 16 aircraft, 4 crew positions and 1 navigator or gunner or bombardier per crew, tightened into a compact striking force. Their names now sit engraved on the silver cups in Dayton. But at Eglin in the spring of 1942 they were simply pilots and co-pilots, and navigators and bombardiers and engineer gunners, learning to yank an overloaded medium bomber off the ground, in a distance no B-25 had ever been asked to accept. The takeoff practice was brutal. A Navy flyer named Henry Miller, on loan from Pensacola, coached them. The idea was to leave the ground in under 500 feet, at a weight that would normally have required more than twice that distance. The pilots held the brakes, ran the engines to full military power, dropped flaps to the correct notch, and released, and the B-25's, tail heavy, nose high, would stagger into the air over the Florida sand at speeds so close to stall that the airframe shuddered. Doolittle himself flew practice runs. He also flew procurement runs, ferrying modifications through the depots, extra fuel tanks welded into bomb bays and crawlways, the belly turrets pulled out to save weight, the tail guns replaced with dummies made of broomsticks painted black to bluff Japanese fighters who might come up from behind. By the end of March, the crews and their 16 chosen aircraft were flown across the country to Alameda, California, and hoisted by crane onto the flight deck of the USS Hornet, one of the newest carriers in the American fleet. The B-25s were parked in an unbroken row from midships to the stern, their tails hanging out over the water. The Hornet put to sea on the 2nd of April 1942, under the command of Captain Mark Mitscher, and only then, once the ship was clear of land, did Mitscher announce over the public address what the deck cargo was for. The Navy crewmen, most of whom had been staring at those bombers for 2 days without being told a thing, reportedly cheered so loudly that the sound carried across to the escorting cruisers. Somewhere in the Pacific, north of Hawaii, the Hornet rendezvoused with a second carrier, the USS Enterprise, under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, whose fighters and dive bombers would provide air cover for the strike force as it steamed westward. The combined task force pushed toward Japan under radio silence, running through weather that greyed the horizon and pitched the deck like a slow metronome. The B-25s, chained down, groaned against their tie-downs. The airmen slept in bunks below, ate in the wardroom, wrote letters they could not mail, and studied target folders that showed factories in Tokyo, dockyards in Yokosuka, oil storage at Yokohama, aircraft plants at Nagoya, steel at Kobe, and industrial districts of Osaka. The plan called for a launch 400 miles from Japan on the evening of April 18th. The aircraft would fly through the night, cross the coast around dawn, strike their targets in the morning, and then continue southwest across the East China Sea, aiming for a string of nationalist Chinese airfields around the city of Kuzhou in Zhejiang province. From there, homing beacons would guide them in. Radios would be lit, ground crews would refuel them. From Kuzhou they would fly deeper into free China and eventually make their way home by whatever slow military transport chain could carry them. That was the plan. There is a phrase soldiers use for what happens to plans. At dawn on April 18, 1942, more than a full day earlier than intended, and roughly 650 miles from the Japanese coast, nearly 250 miles further out than the mission had ever contemplated, the task force ran into a small Japanese patrol vessel called the Nito Maru No. 23 Folds. It was one of a network of picket boats the Japanese Navy maintained in a broad arc east of the home islands, precisely to detect an approach exactly like this one. The Nito Maru was small, wooden, unarmoured, and, from the perspective of the American cruisers that opened fire on it, entirely doomed. But before it went down, it got off a radio transmission, a short urgent burst that would, within minutes, be repeated up the chain of the Japanese combined fleet. American cryptographers on the Enterprise intercepted the transmission. There was no ambiguity. The task force had been seen. The element of surprise, which was the whole architecture of the mission, was gone. Halsey and Doolittle had rehearsed this decision. On the flag bridge, Halsey signalled Hornet. Launch. Launch now. Launch everything. The men in the ready rooms had been eating breakfast. Word came down that the mission was going immediately at extreme range into a rising sea, into weather with visibility that would not have been considered acceptable on any training day at Eglin Field. Doolittle himself, briefing his crews in the last minutes, made the arithmetic plain. They were more than 200 miles further from Japan than any calculation had allowed. The extra fuel they had squeezed into every crevice of the aircraft would be swallowed by the extra distance, and then some. Whatever slack the plan had contained was gone. Whatever margin they had planned to arrive at Chinese airfields with had already been spent, before the wheels even left the deck. If any of them wanted out, this was the moment. None of them took it. At about 8:15 in the morning, ship's time, Doolittle's B-25, the lead aircraft, positioned so that its takeoff run was the shortest of them all, 467 feet from wheel chock to bow, released its brakes and rolled. The Hornet was steaming into the wind at full speed, pitching in a heavy swell. The timing of the launch had to be married to the rhythm of the deck, and Navy signal officers walked each pilot through the release with hand paddles. Doolittle's plane crossed the bow low, dipped toward the water, and then, with agonizing slowness, rose. One after another, the remaining B-25s followed him. 60 seconds apart, 90 seconds apart, some closer, some further, some catching the rise of the deck perfectly, one nearly killing a deckhand whose arm was slashed by a propeller in the chaos of the launch. By 9:19 a.m., all 16 aircraft were airborne. Every one of them cleared the deck. Not a single B-25 was lost on takeoff. A feat, given the conditions that veteran Navy flyers would afterward call impossible. They formed up loosely, or not at all. The launch had been so scrambled that formation flying was largely abandoned and turned west. The horizon ahead was grey and empty. Behind them, the Hornet and her escorts came about, hard, and made for Pearl Harbor at every knot the boilers could sustain, because the task force itself was now a target, and everyone on those decks knew it. For 6 hours, the 16 B-25s pushed across the ocean at wave-top altitude. 100 feet, sometimes 50, engines pulled back to conserve fuel, propellers reflecting off the water. They flew alone or in loose pairs, spaced out across a broad stretch of sky, each aircraft a self-contained problem, its navigator hunched over a chart, its pilot fighting the low altitude and the crosswinds, its gunners watching a sky that had so far produced nothing but cloud. They crossed the Japanese coast at around noon. What happened next is one of the strangest low-level bombing runs of the Second World War, because so little happened. The B-25s came in over Honshu at rooftop altitude and found a country that was not ready for them. Japanese air defense had been calibrated for a naval strike from the sea, an attack that had to arrive at high altitude from carriers whose range was known, on a schedule the Imperial Navy believed it understood. What arrived instead was a formation of American medium bombers appearing over fields and towns without warning, so low that farmers waved at them, and in at least one recorded moment, Japanese schoolchildren waved back. Doolittle's aircraft dropped its bombs on Tokyo, incendiaries and demolition bombs on factories and an oil tank farm in the northeast of the city. The other planes fanned out and struck their assigned targets in Tokyo, in Yokohama, in Yokosuka, in Nagoya, in Kobe. One aircraft, driven off course by fuel worries, released its bombs on the industrial belt around Osaka. Anti-aircraft fire went up, uncoordinated and mostly late. A handful of Japanese fighters scrambled and made passes at the retreating bombers. None of them, in the confusion, brought a B-25 down. The Doolittle Raiders, in the words of the after-action reports, achieved complete tactical surprise and departed the Japanese coast almost intact. The physical damage was not large. Some factories were hit and burned. An aircraft carrier under construction in a Yokosuka dry dock was slightly damaged. A number of Japanese civilians, the raid's own smaller, painful footnote, were killed by errant bombs and strafing. Compared to the raids that would come to Japan later in the war, compared even to a single night of the Great Tokyo Fire Raids of 1945, the Doolittle Raid was a pinprick. It would have taken hundreds of such strikes, and the ordnance capacity of an entire heavy bomber wing to inflict serious industrial harm on the Japanese home islands. Everyone involved, Doolittle, Halsey, the planners in Washington, had known this from the start. But the raid was never really about steel. It was about the mind. In the United States, the news reached the public through a series of teasing, deliberately vague announcements from President Franklin Roosevelt, who declined at a press conference to say where the bombers had come from, and eventually joked that they had launched from a secret base at Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise from James Hilton's Lost Horizon. The joke was picked up everywhere. For the rest of the war, the name of the raid's imagined origin point would linger in American speech. What mattered to the public was not the mechanics, but the fact. American bombs had landed on Tokyo. The war was not, after all, a one-directional catastrophe. Something had, at long last, been done. Newspapers printed the news in bannered type. In factories, in mess halls, in barracks and homes, people cheered. In Tokyo, the reaction was different in tone, but at least as intense. The Japanese army and navy had assured the emperor and the public that the home islands were beyond the reach of American attack. That assurance was now, publicly and undeniably, false. Japanese military leaders were humiliated in a way that no Japanese leader could tolerate. The Imperial Navy, which had missed the American task force until it was almost within striking distance, would within weeks commit itself to the operation at Midway that would end 6 weeks later in the catastrophe that turned the Pacific War. The Imperial Army, which had failed to defend Japanese cities on Japanese ground, would begin, within days, to look for someone on whom to inflict a reply. Its gaze fell, almost immediately, on the coastal provinces of China, where the American bombers were now, presumably, trying to come to earth. Because by the time the citizens of Tokyo were sweeping ash off their roofs, the 16 B-25s were already gone, out over the East China Sea, turning southwest into a weather front that had been thickening all afternoon. The fuel gauges had been a worry from the moment of the early launch. Now, with the sun sinking behind the aircraft and a headwind picking up off the water, they were an emergency. The formation, such as it was, dissolved altogether. Each crew was now flying on its own arithmetic, its own tanks, its own compass, its own guesses about how far the Chinese coast still lay and whether there would be light left in the sky when they arrived. Radio silence, which had held for a day, no longer mattered, but the airfields ahead, still uncertain of the mission, were not lit and not calling. The last time all 80 men had been in the same place was on the flight deck of the Hornet the morning before. The last time any two of them would necessarily see each other for years, or ever, was somewhere over the Chinese coast on the night of April 18th, 1942, when their aircraft pushed into cloud and rain, engines running dry, and each crew, one by one, faced a decision that no plan and no training had ever quite prepared them for. Some would try to belly land on beaches, some would ditch offshore, most would climb, punch through the cloud deck and, when the last of the fuel was gone, jump. 5 silk parachutes at a time, into a black sky over a country they did not know, held by an enemy who was at that very moment learning what they had done, and beginning, methodically, to hunt for them. 16 aircraft had crossed into China. 80 men had crossed with them. What became of those 80 men in the hours and days and years that followed is the story that the Silver Cups in Dayton were built to hold, and the story that, for most of a lifetime after the raid, almost no one outside that shrinking circle of raiders ever fully heard. The night of April 18th belongs in the record to the raid itself, the formation departure, the fires rising over Tokyo, the brief, stunning proof that the thing could be done. But the hours that followed the raid belong to something else entirely, to 16 separate emergencies strung out across several hundred miles of Chinese coastline, each crew alone in the dark, each pilot calculating on dwindling gauges whether the math of survival still held. It did not, for any of them, hold the way they had planned. The extra 170 miles forced on them by the early launch had eaten into every calculation the navigators had made during the weeks of planning aboard the Hornet. Those miles, burned at maximum throttle in the climb off the carrier deck, had consumed fuel that was supposed to carry the aircraft to established Chinese airfields, fields that had been coordinated with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, fields whose runways and radio beacons were supposed to guide the crews in after the attack. The planning had already acknowledged the margins would be razor-thin. The early launch made them something worse than thin. By the time the B-25s cleared Japanese airspace and turned their noses southwest over the East China Sea, most crews were watching fuel needles that had no good news left to deliver. And then the weather came. The front that had been building all afternoon off the Chinese coast was, by evening, a genuine obstacle. A wall of cloud and rain that began at the water's edge and climbed beyond the altitudes the bombers could safely fly. Visibility dropped to nothing useful. Crews that had hoped to find coastline landmarks, to thread their way visually down the river valleys toward the designated fields, found instead only grey murk and rain hammering at the canopy glass. Radio contact, already constrained by the mission's protocols, was increasingly unreliable. The Chinese airfields that were supposed to be lit and ready were neither. The exact reasons for this remain disputed across accounts, but the operational outcome is plain in the record. When the aircraft came within range of the coast, there were no lights to home on, no guiding voices on the frequencies the crews had memorized. 16 bombers, at the extreme outer edge of their range, in the dark, in rain, over a country they had never seen, looking for fields they would not find. They came down wherever the fuel and the mathematics finally dictated. Most of the crews, when they understood that a controlled landing was no longer possible, climbed, pushed the aircraft up through the overcast into whatever thin, cold air lay above, and jumped. 5 men per aircraft, 5 silk parachutes collapsing and catching in the dark, drifting down through cloud toward a country whose language none of them spoke, whose geography most of them knew only from a briefing map. Some came down in flooded rice paddies, the impact cushioned but the cold water a shock after the long hours at altitude. Some landed on hillsides in the dark and lay still for minutes, listening, before understanding that they had survived the descent and now faced the harder question of what came next. Some drifted toward the coast, toward the water, toward the wrong geography entirely. Sergeant William Dieter and Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice did not survive the night. Their aircraft, Crew 6's B-25, fuel exhausted before it could reach solid ground, came down in the sea offshore. What happened in those final minutes is not fully recoverable from the record. The sea was dark, the aircraft had been airborne for hours past the limit of its fuel, and when it hit the water, whatever controlled procedure the crew might have attempted in daylight gave way to the chaos of a nighttime ditching into open ocean. Both men drowned. They were among the younger members of the 80 who had stood on the Hornet's deck that morning, watching the grey Pacific slide past as the carrier pitched into its run. They were dead within hours of the raid they had helped fly, killed not by Japanese fire but by cold water and the basic arithmetic of distance, by the extra 170 miles that the Japanese patrol vessel Nitomaru had, in its final transmissions, effectively subtracted from their reach. Corporal Leland Factor died differently, and no less suddenly. His aircraft came down over the Chinese coast and Factor bailed out with his crew. The parachute opened, but the altitude was wrong. The aircraft had come in from its final approach too fast, or the crew had delayed their exit too long in the disorientation of a nighttime bailout over cloud-hidden ground, or simply the overcast had concealed the terrain until the parachute had no room left to do its work. The accounts are not precise on the details. What they record is the outcome. Factor did not have enough sky beneath him when he jumped. He was 22 years old, 3 men dead in the hours after a mission that every newspaper in America would soon celebrate as a triumph. The raid's official casualty count would be difficult to establish in the days that followed, because the mission's outcome was itself difficult to establish. For weeks, no one in Washington was entirely certain how many of the 16 crews had survived, or where, or in what condition. What could be confirmed almost immediately was that the aircraft were gone. Whether the men were gone as well was a question that would take much longer and far more painful work to answer. One crew, at least, sent back a clear answer relatively quickly, though the answer it sent was not the one anyone had planned for. Captain Edward York had taken off from the Hornet that morning with the same orders and the same fuel load as every other crew. He had hit his targets, but over the China coast, running the same dwindling calculations as every other pilot, York had made a different assessment of what the numbers meant. His aircraft did not have enough fuel to reach Free China. Occupied China lay behind him. Ahead to the northwest lay the Soviet Union, technically a neutral power in the Pacific War, bound by the Russo-Japanese Neutrality Pact that Stalin had signed with Tokyo in April 1941 and was not yet prepared to surrender. American planners had known, in the weeks before the raid, that the Soviets could not be seen to assist an offensive operation against Japan. The diplomacy was precise, and the constraints were real. York flew north anyway. His B-25 crossed into Soviet territory near Vladivostok and put down at a Soviet airfield. The crew, Lieutenant Robert Emmons, Sergeant David Pohl, Staff Sergeant Theodore Laban, and Corporal David Hernandez, were met by Soviet soldiers who were professionally courteous and immovably firm on the relevant diplomatic reality. 5 Americans had brought their aircraft onto Soviet soil and could not simply be permitted to leave. York and his crew were transported inland and interned. The Soviets placed them in conditions that were uncomfortable but not brutal, a holding facility first, then a series of accommodations at a deliberate remove from any facility that might appear to support their mission, as Soviet officials navigated the delicate geometry of maintaining the neutrality agreement with Japan while housing 5 men who had just bombed Tokyo. They would remain in Soviet custody for over a year, not in the conditions their fellow raiders were enduring elsewhere, the hunger, the interrogation, the systematic destruction of health and will, but in a limbo that was in its own way corrosive. The knowledge that the war was continuing, that the raid they had risked their lives on had succeeded, that their comrades were fighting or dying or working their way home through occupied China, while they sat in a country that was not the enemy, but was not quite an ally either. They eventually made their way out through Iran in 1943, in an escape that had the practiced ambiguity of an arrangement, whether the Soviets had turned a blind eye or actively assisted, or simply allowed the geography to do its work, remained a question that neither side chose to answer plainly. York's crew came home. They came home late, and by an improbable route, but they came home whole. That was the exception. Elsewhere, in Shanghai and Nanjing and Beijing, in the concrete cells and the wooden interrogation rooms, in the corridors that smelled of disinfectant and mildew and rice water, 5 other men were living inside a very different clock. Their death sentences had been commuted. What that phrase meant in the practice of the Japanese military prison system in the middle years of the Pacific War was not clemency. It was a decision to prolong the sentence rather than execute it, to keep 5 American airmen alive as bargaining pieces of uncertain future value, to hold them where they could be produced or disposed of according to whatever calculations the leadership in Tokyo might later find useful. In the meantime, they would be held in a regime of isolation and deprivation that in its slowest workings was not meaningfully distinguishable from execution. It only took longer. Robert Meader, Chase Nielsen, Robert Hite, George Barr, Jacob DeShazer, 5 names, 5 cells, 5 men who by the autumn of 1942 knew that the trial they had faced in Shanghai had been a piece of theatre with a script prepared before they were brought in. 3 of their fellow captured raiders, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, Harold Spatz, had been taken out on the 15th of October, driven to a cemetery on the outskirts of Shanghai, tied to wooden crosses, and shot. The 5 survivors were not told this at the time. They were told nothing at all. They were moved between facilities, each transfer conducted with the same procedural blankness. A hood, a truck, a new cell, a new set of guards who did not speak to them and did not need to. Solitary confinement was the baseline condition of their captivity. Of the roughly 40 months they would spend as prisoners, 34 would be spent alone, in cells engineered to make the passage of time itself into a form of punishment. The physical regime was straightforward. The rations were insufficient to sustain a healthy adult male at rest, let alone one confined to a small cell with no exercise and no medical attention. The prisoners' weight fell month by month. Their teeth loosened, their gums bled. The tissue at their extremities began to swell with the soft, spongy edema of beriberi, the disease of thiamine deficiency, of a diet stripped of anything a body could use to keep its nerves functioning. Beriberi in its advanced form corrodes the nervous system and the heart. It brings a fog to the mind that no effort of will can burn off. It leaves men unable to feel their own feet, unable to count reliably, unable to complete a sentence they have begun. Alongside it came dysentery, chronic, humiliating, physically exhausting, the constant fluid loss compounding the malnutrition, until the 2 conditions became a single downward spiral. All 5 men suffered from both. The guards, when they noticed, did not intervene. There was no doctor. There was, on rare occasions, a cursory examination performed by a medical orderly whose function appeared to be documentation rather than treatment. Against this, the prisoners built what they could. Robert Meader, a lieutenant, a co-pilot on Crew 6, the crew that had ditched in the sea and lost Dieter and Fitzmaurice to drowning, appears in the survivors' later accounts as the moral organizer of the group. When the men were briefly close enough to whisper through walls or across a corridor, when a transfer put them in adjoining cells for a matter of days or weeks, Maida pressed them to keep their minds moving. He called it intellectual calisthenics. He proposed that each man remember in order every teacher he had ever had, every street of his hometown, every book he had ever finished. He asked them to do arithmetic in their heads, to recite poems, to conjugate verbs in whatever languages they could scrape from memory. He was not building a school. He was building a defence against the thing solitary confinement is designed to do, the slow leaching of the self, the gradual replacement of a person by the room he inhabits. Maida understood, better than most of them, that a mind left idle in a cell would eventually accept the cell's terms. He also understood, though he did not say so, that his own body was failing faster than the others. Maida had been sick since the crash. The ditching had exposed him to the water for hours, and something in his lungs or his gut had never recovered. The prison regime accelerated what the crash had begun. By the summer of 1943 he was visibly wasted. By autumn he could no longer stand for the guards' counts without holding the wall. He asked repeatedly for medical care. He did not receive it. On the 1st of December 1943, some sources record the date as the 11th, and the exact day was uncertain to the other prisoners at the time. Robert Maida died in his cell in Qiangwan prison camp, on the outskirts of Shanghai. The official cause was recorded as beriberi. The actual cause was a decision, extended over months, not to feed him and not to treat him. He was 26 years old. His death, when the other four learned of it, produced two effects that the Japanese command may not have anticipated. The first was a slight and grudging improvement in the material conditions of the survivors. Rations increased marginally. A doctor was permitted to see them. The cells were, on occasion, cleaned. Whether this reflected a bureaucratic anxiety about producing a second dead prisoner and the paperwork that would follow, or a private decision by a camp commander who had understood the arithmetic of his own responsibility, was never determined. The second effect was on the four men themselves. Maida had held them together across walls they could not see through. His absence forced each of them to hold himself together alone. Chase Nielsen, later, would describe the months after Maida's death as the hardest of the entire imprisonment, not because the conditions were worse, but because the organising intelligence at the centre of their small resistance was gone. Nielsen was a navigator. He had come down over eastern China with Crew 6 alongside Maida, Dieter and Fitzmaurice, and had swum ashore in the dark after the ditching. He had been picked up by a Japanese patrol within days. In the interrogations that followed, at Shanghai, at Tokyo, back at Shanghai, Nielsen had been subjected to a specific and documented protocol of coercion. He was strapped to a bench. A cloth was placed over his face. Water was poured onto the cloth in a steady, controlled stream, in quantities calibrated to produce the sensation of drowning without producing actual death. The technique, in the Japanese military of that period, was referred to in the interrogators' shorthand as the water cure. Nielsen was subjected to it repeatedly. He was also beaten, deprived of sleep for stretches that he later estimated in the range of days rather than hours, and threatened with immediate execution on multiple occasions in circumstances designed to make the threat plausible. He gave the interrogators the outlines of information they already possessed and refused to elaborate. He survived because at some point in the process his captors calculated that the information they might extract was no longer worth the effort of extracting it. After the war, Nielsen would testify at length about what had been done to him and to the others. His testimony, delivered under oath at a military tribunal in Shanghai in 1946, is one of the primary historical records of the treatment of the captured raiders. It is not a dramatic document. Nielsen was a careful witness, disinclined to embellishment, precise about what he could remember and honest about what he could not. He described the water cure in clinical detail. He described the cells. He described Maida's decline and death. He named the guards he could name, and identified in photographs the officers who had ordered the trial. His deposition would help to convict 4 Japanese officers of war crimes related to the treatment of the raiders, a small legal outcome and one that Nielsen would speak of in later years with a marked absence of satisfaction. The men who had tortured him had been junior functionaries in a system whose senior architects were, for the most part, beyond legal reach. Robert Haight, the co-pilot of Crew 16, the plane that carried de Chazer as its bombardier, had come down in the same general region as several other crews and had been captured within a day, along with the rest of his aircraft's men. Haight spent his 40 months in captivity moving between the same facilities as the others, subject to the same regime. He was a tall man, and the starvation showed on his frame more visibly than on the others. Photographs taken immediately after his liberation in August 1945 record a face collapsed inward on itself, cheekbones and jaw carrying the skin like a tent frame, eyes set deep in shadowed sockets. Height would recover physically over the years that followed. What he had endured psychologically was harder to measure, and he spoke of it, when he spoke of it at all, with the flat economy of a man who had decided long ago that the alternative to describing it briefly was not describing it in full, but not describing it at all. George Barr, the navigator of Crew 16, had the worst time of the 4 survivors. Barr was a red-headed, quick-tempered young man who had entered the war with a certain natural buoyancy that the prison system was specifically designed to extinguish. His decline was not primarily physical, though he too suffered from beriberi and dysentery in the standard progression. What happened to Barr was that the isolation reached him differently than it reached the others. By the time of the liberation, he was unable to trust his own perceptions. He was hospitalized for months after his return, not for the visible wasting which recovered on ordinary food, but for the invisible damage that solitary confinement had done to the connections between what he saw and what he believed. His recovery was slow. It was assisted, in the post-war years, by the intervention of Jimmy Doolittle himself, who personally involved himself in Barr's care and made sure that the Army's medical bureaucracy did not lose track of a man whose injuries did not fit the standard forms. Barr eventually rebuilt a life. That he rebuilt one at all was, by the assessment of the doctors who treated him, a nearer thing than the public record has often acknowledged. DeShaze's story would run in a different direction, and it would run there because of a book. But that comes shortly. First, the shape of what the 4 survivors carried out of Kiangwan and into the August daylight of 1945. 40 months of captivity, 34 of them alone, all 4 suffering from the residual effects of malnutrition, chronic dysentery, and the neurological damage of prolonged thiamine deficiency. All 4 having watched a 5th man, Maida, die of neglect over the course of a year. All 4 having been beaten, and in Nielsen's case tortured methodically, in circumstances they would never be able to fully describe to anyone who had not been there. All 4 returning to a country that had celebrated their mission for 3 years without knowing that its price for them had been this. DeShazer would later write of the imprisonment in a single sentence that captured what the 4 had shared. They had been imprisoned and beaten, half-starved, terribly tortured, and denied by solitary confinement even the comfort of association with one another. Association with one another, the phrase is worth pausing on. It records precisely what the captors had tried to take away, and what the captives, through Maida's calisthenics, through whispered arithmetic, through the small conspiracies of shared memory, had refused to fully surrender. That is one thread of the aftermath. It ends with 4 men walking out of a Chinese prison in the late summer of 1945, thin as paper, blinking in a light they had not seen in nearly 4 years. The other thread, the thread of the 69, begins on the same night as the ditching and the bailout, and runs in a different direction entirely, into the hills and paddies and river towns of eastern China, where the survival of most of the raid's airmen was being arranged, hour by hour, by people whose names would not appear in any American newspaper. The geography is worth holding in mind. The B-25s came down across a broad arc of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, coastal and inland regions south of Shanghai and west toward the mountainous interior, terrain that in April 1942 sat under a patchwork of control. Japanese forces held the cities, the rail lines, the main roads, the coastal strip. The countryside between and beyond these was contested, nominally Japanese, actually a complicated country of nationalist guerrilla units, local militias, farming villages whose loyalties had been shaped by 3 years of occupation, and Catholic mission stations whose priests had been in the region longer than the war itself. Into this landscape, in the dark of the night of April 18th and the dawn of April 19th, 69 American airmen descended by parachute or emerged, wet and stunned, from beached wreckage on the coast. They spoke no Chinese. They had a handful of survival items each, and in most cases a small silk map printed in colours that had already begun to run in the rain. What happened next was not luck. Consider the mechanics of what a Chinese farmer in a village in Zhejiang would have understood on the morning of April 19, 1942, if he came out of his hut at dawn and found a large white man in a torn flight suit lying in his rice paddy. He would have understood first that the man was American, because the war news had made the possibility discussable, and the man's uniform was unmistakably not Japanese. He would have understood, second, that hiding the man was punishable by death. Not by a fine, not by imprisonment, not by a beating, by execution, and in the practice of the Japanese occupation forces of that period, by the execution of not merely the individual but of the village. Reprisals against civilian populations for aiding enemy combatants were doctrine. They had been applied at scale in other parts of occupied China throughout the previous 3 years. The farmer in the paddy would have known this. He would have known it not as an abstract policy, but as something that had already happened in other villages to other people whose names he might have heard. The farmer hid the man. Across 100 villages in the days that followed, 100 farmers made the same decision. The airmen were pulled out of paddies and creek beds and the wreckage of aircraft that had come in low across the countryside and torn themselves apart on hillsides and treetops. They were carried into farmhouses and hidden in root cellars, in haylofts, in the false bottoms of ox carts, in the storage rooms of shrines. They were fed rice porridge and boiled eggs, food that came off tables where the family itself was already eating short. They were given clothing to replace the flight suits that would identify them at a glance to any Japanese patrol, peasant tunics, straw hats, cloth shoes, the neutral wardrobe of a Chinese countryside labourer. They were told, through gestures and drawings and the occasional intervention of a village schoolteacher who spoke a few English words, to be quiet, to be still, to wait. Then they were moved. This was the extraordinary part, not the initial sheltering, which is a decision an individual can make in a moment, but the sustained, coordinated movement of dozens of American airmen across hundreds of miles of occupied and contested territory, through Japanese patrols and roadblocks, along rivers and mountain paths, from village to village, until they arrived in the areas controlled by nationalist Chinese forces and could be handed off to organised military escort. This kind of movement is not spontaneous. It requires a network. It requires people who know who to trust in the next village over and in the village after that, and who to avoid. It requires stretcher bearers and boatmen and cooks and lookouts. It requires, above all, a willingness by every link in the chain to accept the same risk that the first farmer accepted, in the same knowledge that discovery meant not merely their own death, but the death of their families and neighbours. In Zhejiang, the network functioned through a combination of nationalist guerrilla units, mission station clergy, and village elders whose authority extended along ancestral lines, older than any modern political arrangement. In the region around Kuzhou, a small city in western Zhejiang that served as one of the intended landing sites for the raid's aircraft, and whose airfield had been standing dark and unmanned when the crews had come in over the coast, the network processed as many as 51 of the 69 escapees. 51 Americans moving in ones and twos and threes, hidden in the traffic of a rural region that had learned in 3 years of occupation how to hide things from Japanese eyes. They were passed hand to hand. That is the phrase the surviving airmen used later when they tried to describe what had happened to them. Hand to hand, from a farmer to a fisherman, from a fisherman to a village headman, from a headman to a priest to a guerrilla courier, from a guerrilla courier to a nationalist officer with a map and a route to the interior, each hand knowing only the next hand. Each transfer conducted quickly, quietly, and with the discipline of people who'd been doing this, for other fugitives, for other missions, for other purposes, since 1938. The Catholic missions played a specific and documented role. There had been a European Catholic presence in Zhejiang and Jiangxi since the 19th century, and the mission stations, small compounds attached to modest churches, staffed by a handful of priests and lay brothers, most of them European by birth but by 1942 more Chinese than not in their daily lives, sat at nodes in the countryside that the airmen's rescuers used as way stations. A priest could shelter a wounded man without arousing suspicion, because a priest sheltered whoever came to the door. A mission could provide bandages and simple medical care that a farming village could not. Several of the airmen, particularly the injured, Ted Lawson most famously, whose leg would require amputation performed on a mission table by an American doctor who had been passed through the same chain of hands, owed their survival to the intervention of Catholic clergy who never asked for and never received any recognition for what they had done. Stretchers appear again and again in the surviving accounts. Airmen who had come down badly, with broken ankles, with concussions, with the various injuries that low-altitude parachute drops produce, could not walk the distances involved. They were carried, 2 or 4 men to a stretcher, rotating in shifts, moving at night along paths that avoided the roads, sometimes covering only a few miles between dawn and dawn, because the terrain and the patrols required it. The stretcher bearers were villagers. They were not paid in any organised sense. They ate what the villagers fed them. They went home when their portion of the route was done, and another set of bearers took the stretcher forward. The airman on the stretcher in most cases had no way to thank them and no way even to know who they had been. He knew only that he had been picked up in one place and set down in another, and that the shoulders under his weight had changed a dozen times along the way. Haystacks appear in the accounts, ox carts with false floors, sampans on rivers, the airman lying flat under a tarp among nets and baskets, the boatman poling casually past a Japanese sentry post as if he were carrying nothing more remarkable than the day's catch. In one documented rescue, an airman was concealed inside a coffin and moved through a Japanese checkpoint in a funeral procession, the mourner's grief loud enough and public enough to discourage inspection. In another, a farmer's wife dressed a wounded American in her deceased father-in-law's clothing and produced him at a roadblock as an elderly relative being taken to a doctor, her body positioned to keep the sentry's gaze away from the face. These stories are not folklore. They come out of the post-war debriefings of the airmen themselves, cross-checked, when it could be done, against the recollections of the Chinese rescuers who lived to tell their side. What emerges from them is the picture of a rescue conducted not by a service or an agency or a formal resistance, but by a population, a countryside that had decided, in the aggregate and without any central coordinating body, that these particular strangers were going to be saved. The population knew the price. This is the part that has to be held steadily in view, because it is the part that has most often been softened or omitted in the American telling. The Chinese civilians who sheltered the Doolittle Raiders were not operating under any illusion about what the Japanese Imperial Army did to villages that were found to have harboured enemy airmen. The occupation had trained them, over the preceding years, in the specifics of collective punishment. The village headmen who accepted an airman into their care understood that they were placing every family in the village at hazard. The farmers who fed the airmen understood that the food would be traceable if a patrol arrived while the man was still in the barn. The stretcher bearers who moved the wounded understood that being caught with an American in a stretcher was a death sentence not only for the two men carrying the poles, but for the household to which they returned when the shift was done. They accepted the risk anyway, not because they were told to, not because they were paid, because the war had presented them with a choice, and they made it. The reckoning came in the summer months that followed. The Japanese command, once the general shape of the rescue network became clear, would launch a campaign specifically designed to punish Zhejiang and Jiangxi for what the countryside had done. That campaign, and its scale, and its meaning, belong to a later thread. What matters here is that the airmen made it out, 69 of them, in ones and twos and small groups, passing through the hands of thousands of Chinese who never met each other and never coordinated as a single body, and yet who together constituted one of the largest and most successful civilian rescue operations of the entire Second World War. By the middle of May 1942, most of the surviving raiders had reached Chongqing or other points in Free China, from which they could be evacuated to India and eventually returned to their units. They came out thin, exhausted, and, in many cases, profoundly aware that they were alive because ordinary people who owed them nothing had chosen to risk everything. Not all of them came out that summer. 8, as already recorded, had been taken by the Japanese. Of those, 5 would live to the end of the war, and 4 to see home. But there is a 6th figure inside that count of the captured whose story runs alongside the other 4's and yet points somewhere the other 4's did not point. Because inside the same cells, under the same regime, subjected to the same regime of starvation and isolation, one of the 5 sentenced men underwent a transformation that no one, least of all himself, had anticipated on the day he was captured. Jacob de Shazer had bailed out of Crew 16 over eastern China on the night of April 18th, 1942, and had been picked up within days by a Japanese patrol. He had been beaten in the initial captures, he had been tried in Shanghai and sentenced to death, and then, in the same abrupt bureaucratic reversal that spared Nielsen and Haidt and Barr and Maeder, had his sentence commuted. From that point forward, he lived what the others lived. He starved on the same rations, he shivered in the same unheated cells, he fought the same slow neurological unravelling of beriberi. And like the others, he did all of this alone. The solitary confinement was the specific instrument by which the Japanese command intended to reduce these men to something less than themselves before killing them or releasing them. DeShazer entered captivity with a rage that his fellow prisoners, in their later accounts, described as remarkable even in a context where every prisoner had reason to hate. He had watched Hallmark and Farrow and Spatz taken away to be shot, or he had understood, from the shape of the transfers and the absences, what had happened to them. He had been beaten by guards whose faces he memorised and whose deaths he privately imagined in detail. The hatred, he later wrote, was a kind of physical presence inside him, something he lived with, in the cell, more constantly than hunger or cold. It gave him something to hold on to. It also, he came to feel, was eating him from the inside faster than the beriberi. In June 1944, 26 months into his captivity, in a military prison in Beijing where he and the 4 other survivors had been consolidated after several previous transfers, DeShazer asked the guards for a Bible. He was not, in any developed sense, a religious man at that point. The request was closer to an intellectual exercise, an application of Mida's principle, give the mind something to work on. To his surprise, the guards produced one. It was in English. They allowed him to keep it for 3 weeks. He read it twice. What happened in that cell? Over those 3 weeks, DeShazer would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. He was a bombardier, not a theologian, and the language he used afterward was plain to the point of self-deprecation. He said that he had gone into the reading with hatred and had come out of it with something else. Not the absence of hatred exactly, but the presence of a different thing in the place where the hatred had been. He said that he had looked at his guards, after he handed the Bible back at the end of the 3 weeks, and that they had appeared to him differently than they had appeared before. He said that he had understood in some way that he could not have articulated in April 1942 that the men who were starving him were themselves inhabitants of a system that had cost them, in its own way, as much as it was costing him. He said, in a phrase that appeared in a pamphlet he wrote after the war, that God had given him new spiritual eyes, and that when he looked at his captors he could only feel pity for them. The transformation did not shorten his sentence. It did not soften his cell. He remained in that Beijing prison for another 14 months, on the same rations and under the same regime, until American forces liberated the surviving prisoners in August 1945. He came out weighing less than 100 pounds. His mind, unlike Barr's, had held together. Held together, he would say, precisely because during the last 14 months of the imprisonment he had had something to hold. He went home to Oregon. He recovered his weight. He entered a seminary. In 1948, 3 years after his liberation, and 6 years after he had bailed out of a burning B-25 over a country he had come to bomb, Jacob DeShazer returned to Japan. He returned as a missionary. He would live in Japan for more than 30 years, speaking Japanese, raising a family in Japanese communities, preaching a message of reconciliation in cities that had felt the war more directly than most Americans ever would. He would meet, among many others, a former Japanese naval officer named Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the aerial attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, who read one of DeShazer's pamphlets in the post-war years and, in a chain of encounters that neither man had planned, came to a Christian conversion of his own. The 2 men would appear together in later years at revival meetings in Japan and in the United States, the bombardier who had struck Nagoya and the airman who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, standing on the same stage, telling a story that neither of their governments in 1941 could have imagined either of them telling. DeShazer died in 2008, at the age of 95, in the state where he had been born. He had spent more of his life in Japan than in America. His story, held against the story of the other 3 survivors, Nielsen testifying at war crimes tribunals, Haidt silent about what he had endured, Barr rebuilt piece by piece by a general who refused to let the army lose him, completes the shape of what 40 months of captivity had produced in 5 men. 1 had died, 4 had survived, and of those 4, each had come out carrying something different: a witness's testimony, a private silence, a slow reconstruction of self, and, in DeShazer's case, a vocation that would send him back into the country that had tried to kill him. The 4 came home in the late summer of 1945 to a nation that was celebrating a victory whose closing chapter, the 2 atomic bombings, had rendered the war they had been fighting almost unrecognizable. Their return was quiet, by the standards of what they had endured. There were no parades specifically for them. The photographs of their emaciated frames were taken, filed, and largely not published. The details of what had happened to them in Qiangwan and Beijing would emerge slowly, in tribunal testimony and in the memoirs of individual raiders over the years and decades that followed. The full record was still being assembled long after most Americans had stopped paying attention to it. Behind them, in the villages of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, the accounting of what the rescues had cost the Chinese countryside was still being conducted, not in tribunals and not in memoirs, but in the empty houses and burned fields and unmarked graves that the Japanese reprisal campaign had left across the region in the summer and autumn of 1942. That accounting began within weeks of the raid itself. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters did not need long to understand what had happened, or to decide how it intended to respond. 16 American bombers had appeared over the home islands in daylight. They had come from a carrier they should not have been able to reach. They had flown onto the coast of China, and they had gone down among Chinese villages, and those villages, with a coordination that was less coordinated than it looked, and more instinctive than any staff officer in Tokyo could quite believe, had passed the airmen westward, hand to hand toward free China. The lesson the Imperial Army took from that fact was blunt. If the Chinese countryside could hide 16 bomber crews in the weeks after a raid, it could hide more. If the airfields the raiders had been intending to reach, Chuchao, Yushan, Lishui, and the smaller fields scattered across eastern Zhejiang, were serviceable enough to receive American planes at all, they were serviceable enough to be used again, and if a population of farmers and boatmen and priests and schoolteachers could be relied upon to shelter foreign flyers on sight, then the population itself was, in the language of the operation to come, a military problem. The order came down in the first half of May. General Shunroku Hata, commander of the China Expeditionary Army, was given the campaign. In its planning documents it carried the codename Seigo. In the ledgers of Chinese history it would be recorded as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Roughly 200,000 troops were assembled for it, drawn from divisions already deployed in central and eastern China and reinforced by units brought in specifically for the offensive. Its stated military objectives were two: to destroy the airfields of eastern Zhejiang before they could be used again, and to break the guerrilla and civilian networks that had moved the American airmen out of the coastal provinces. Its unstated objective, which was scarcely unstated at all in the conduct of the campaign, was to make the price of sheltering an American so high that no Chinese village would ever choose to pay it again. The campaign opened on the 15th of May 1942, less than a month after the raiders had come down out of the sky. It would run until the 4th of September of that same year, 3.5 months of concentrated destruction across an area larger than most European countries. Columns of Japanese infantry moved out of Hangzhou and out of the Yangtze Corridor and into the interior of Zhejiang and then southwest into Jiangxi, along axes that had been chosen to sweep the countryside rather than to seize any particular city. The airfields fell quickly. Chuchao, the field the raiders had been trying to reach on the night of the 18th, was overrun and systematically destroyed, its runways broken up, its buildings burned, the surrounding villages searched house by house for evidence of American passage. Yushan followed. Lishui followed. Every airstrip within reach of the advance was denied not merely to future use, but, in the Japanese conception of denial, to any possibility of future use. Runways ploughed, hangars levelled, fuel dumps set alight. The ground itself dug over so that no landing surface could be improvised from what had been left. What happened alongside the destruction of the airfields is the darker line of the operation. Japanese columns entered villages that had lain along the escape routes of the American crews. They entered villages where a doctor had bandaged a foreign airman's leg. They entered villages where a family had put a foreigner in dry clothes and given him rice and pointed him westward. They entered, in many cases, villages that had had no direct contact with any raider at all, but that lay in the wrong districts on the wrong maps. The pattern that emerged, reconstructed later from survivor testimony and from Chinese government records, is a pattern of scorched earth reprisal applied with method. Houses were burned, rice stores were burned or seized, livestock was slaughtered, men of military age were shot or bayoneted, women were assaulted, elderly villagers who could not be moved were killed where they lay. In some places, entire settlements were emptied and then destroyed, the buildings pulled down or set alight, the wells fouled, the fields left to run to weeds. Where a specific act of assistance to the Americans could be identified, the reprisal took a specific form. The family who had helped was killed, and often their neighbours as well, and often the village elders who had permitted the help to be given. In the town of Nancheng in Jiangxi, Japanese troops occupied the settlement for weeks and on withdrawing systematically destroyed what they had used. Similar patterns are recorded in Yushan, in Qinhua, in dozens of smaller places whose names appear only in local gazetteers. The chronicle is not evenly kept. Some counties have detailed casualty rolls compiled in the years that followed. Others have only the fact of depopulation, the villages that appear on pre-war maps and are simply absent from post-war ones, without any record surviving of what specifically happened to the people who had lived in them. To this catalogue of ordinary atrocity, the campaign added a category of horror that belongs to Seigo alone among the operations of the war in China. Unit 731, the biological warfare branch of the Kwantung Army, headquartered at Pingfang in Manchuria, was drawn into the operation. Its scientists and its stockpiles were moved south. Pathogens, bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, dysentery, were released into the water supplies of villages, sprayed from low-flying aircraft over cultivated fields, and left in the form of contaminated foodstuffs in settlements the Japanese columns were about to abandon. Rice cakes laced with typhoid bacilli were reportedly handed out to hungry villagers by withdrawing troops. Wells were seeded with cholera cultures. Fleas infected with plague were dispersed by hand in some districts and by aerial spray in others. The intent of these dispersals, on the evidence of the surviving Unit 731 documentation and the testimony of former personnel gathered after the war, was double: to inflict casualties on the Chinese population in a way that would be difficult to attribute in the moment, and to acquire operational data on the effectiveness of biological weapons deployed in populated terrain. In the terms of the unit's internal record-keeping, the campaign was in part a field trial. The population of eastern Zhejiang and northern Jiangxi was, in this sense, being used simultaneously as the target of a punitive expedition, and as a test subject for weapons the Imperial Army wanted to understand better. The pathogens did not stay where they were placed. They moved through the water table and through markets and along the roads that refugees were using to flee the advance. Outbreaks of plague and cholera persisted in the region for years after the Japanese columns had withdrawn, killing people who had never seen an American, who had never seen a Japanese soldier, who had no idea why illness had come to their village and no framework in which to place it. Chinese casualty figures for the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign have never been settled precisely, and the range of estimates itself carries a moral weight. On the low end, careful reconstructions place civilian dead at somewhere in the tens of thousands. The most widely cited figure, drawn from Chinese nationalist records compiled in the immediate post-war years and repeated in the standard histories, puts the civilian death toll at approximately 250,000. Chinese military casualties are estimated at around 70,000 additional dead. The higher civilian figure, if it is accepted, means that for every one of the 69 American airmen whom the Chinese countryside carried to safety, roughly 3,500 Chinese civilians died in the reprisal. It is a ratio that does not appear on any American memorial. It does not appear in the citations for the Medal of Honor awarded to Jimmy Doolittle. It does not appear on the plaques beneath the 16 aircraft names in the museum in Dayton. For those Chinese who survived the campaign, its consequences continued long after the Japanese columns had marched back to their garrisons. Fields that had been sown in the spring of 1942 had gone unharvested. Seed stocks had been destroyed. Draft animals had been killed or driven off. Famine followed the campaign into the winter of 1942 and 1943, taking additional lives that no ledger has ever quite managed to count separately from the campaign itself. The plague and cholera outbreaks continued to recur. Whole districts of Zhejiang saw their populations halve, or worse. Reconstruction, when it eventually came slowly, and it came without American help, and it came without much American awareness that reconstruction was needed at all. In Washington, in Chongqing, and in the offices of the Army Air Forces, the campaign was known in outline as it was happening. American intelligence services received reports from Chinese liaison officers. Missionaries who'd been in the affected districts wrote accounts. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek raised the matter in its diplomatic communications with the United States, sometimes in the context of appeals for greater American aid, and sometimes as a straightforward record of what was occurring. The scale and the specifically retaliatory character of the operation was understood at the higher levels of the American war effort. It was not concealed from those who had reason to know. It was, however, not shared with the American public, whose morale in the summer of 1942 was still being cultivated with the buoyant image of Jimmy Doolittle's 30 seconds over Tokyo. The dissonance between what the raid meant in the United States and what it had cost in the countryside of eastern China was maintained through a mission on both sides of the Pacific, and it would persist, in its essentials, for the better part of the following 70 years. Doolittle himself learned what was happening in stages. He had been on the ground in China when the campaign began. In the days after the raid, having come down by parachute near Chuchao and made his way west with the help of Chinese guides, he sat in a walled compound and did his own accounting. He had lost all 16 of his aircraft. 3 of his men were dead. Others were missing, and he did not yet know that 8 of them had been taken by the Japanese. He believed sitting there in the days after the raid that he had failed. He had been given 16 bombers and 80 men, and an assignment that no one in the Army Air Forces had ever attempted, and he had brought back no aircraft and could not yet account for all of his crews. In the framework of his own career, and of what he understood about the calculus of American military justice, the outcome was court-martial. He said as much in those days to the men who reached him. He expected to be relieved. He expected to face charges. He expected at best a return to the United States under a cloud that would follow him for the rest of his service. What arrived instead was a promotion and a decoration. The news came through in the days following the raid, transmitted along the crooked channels that connected the interior of China to Washington. Doolittle had been jumped 2 grades, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general in a single order. He was to receive the Medal of Honor. The ceremony, when he returned to the United States, would be held at the White House with President Roosevelt presiding. The reception in America was not the reception he had expected. The raid was being celebrated. The photograph of the bombers on the deck of the Hornet, the accounts of the strike on Tokyo, the phrase Shangri-La, which the president had offered to reporters as the notional launching point of the raid, all of it had become, in a matter of days, one of the strongest morale properties the United States possessed, in a war that had otherwise offered mostly bad news since Pearl Harbor. Doolittle wore the medal. He accepted the promotion. He did the interviews. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, and then the 15th in the Mediterranean, and then the 8th in England, and he flew the strategic air war over Europe for the remainder of the conflict. He was in every visible sense one of the successful commanders of the war. But he had been on the ground in China. He had seen what the countryside looked like in the days after the raid, before the Japanese offensive had even begun. He had been sheltered briefly by Chinese villagers and moved by Chinese soldiers, and he had understood, as clearly as anyone in an American uniform could have understood it, that these were the people who had made his survival possible. When word of the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign began to reach him, piecemeal at first, in intelligence summaries and diplomatic reports, and then more fully after the war, he did not treat it as an abstraction. In the accounts that survive from Doolittle's later life, in his memoir and in the recollections of those who knew him well, the acknowledgement of the Chinese cost of the raid appears with a persistence that is not accidental. He was capable of the direct sentence. The raid, he would say in one form or another for the rest of his life, had succeeded because of the sacrifices made by the American and Chinese people. He named both. He named them in that order not because the Chinese sacrifice had been smaller, but because the American sacrifice, in the grammar of his profession, came first. But the Chinese sacrifice was always there in his sentence. He did not permit it to be edited out. He did not permit the raid to be described in his presence as a purely American operation. He was at the same time a man of his generation and his uniform, and he did not devote his post-war years to a public reckoning with what the Chinese countryside had endured. The full scale of the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign was not known in the American public sphere in the 1940s or the 1950s, and Doolittle was not the man to make it known. He gave his testimony at the tribunals where his testimony was called for. He supported the prosecutions of the officers responsible for the executions of Hallmark and Farrow and Spatz. He worked, quietly and effectively, to hold together the surviving fabric of his crew, the effort on behalf of Robert Barr, the presence at reunions, the personal correspondence with widows and with parents of the dead. He carried, in the phrase that appears in more than one description of him from the men who served under him, a kind of measured seriousness whenever the raid itself was the subject. He did not gloat. He did not wear the raid the way it could have been worn. Those who observed him closely in the post-war decades recognized that he understood the accounting better than the public celebration allowed him to say aloud. The reunion tradition, which would become the central private ritual of the remaining raiders' lives, took shape in that same silence. The first gathering was informal. In December 1945, with the war ended and the surviving raiders scattered across the country, a small number of them met to remember the raid on the anniversary that would suit their calendars. It was the sort of gathering that dozens of American units were holding in that first post-war winter. Reunions built out of the raw need of men who had lived through something together to sit in a room with one another again. The Raiders' version differed only in one respect. It was small enough and specific enough that every member of it could plausibly attend. 80 men had flown the raid. Fewer than 80 remained. But the number was small enough that a reunion was not an abstraction. It was, in principle, a gathering that could contain every living member of the operation. Through the second half of the 1940s, the reunions were sporadic. Through the early 1950s, they began to settle into a pattern. By the middle of the decade, an annual meeting had become the practice, held on or near the anniversary of the raid, moving from city to city among American communities that had reason to claim a connection to the operation. Doolittle's presence at these gatherings was consistent. His stewardship of them was quiet and definite. The men who had flown for him treated him, in their old age as in their youth, as the pole around which the group's identity was arranged. He did not command the reunions, he attended them. But his attendance was itself a form of statement, that the operation was not to be forgotten, that the men were not to be scattered, that the accounting of what had been done and what had been paid for it would be kept, at least among themselves, in the years the country had begun to move past. In 1959, the ritual acquired its central object. The city of Tucson, Arizona, which had come to think of itself as a home port for the raiders. A number of them had been trained or stationed nearby, and the community's pride in the connection was durable, commissioned a set of 80 silver goblets to be presented to the group. The set was designed with a specific ceremonial purpose in mind. Each goblet was engraved on both faces with the name of one raider. On one side, the name was engraved right side up. On the other side, the same name was engraved upside down. The design solved a problem the group had not yet had to face but had already begun to think about. When a raider died, his goblet would be inverted. The upside-down engraving would then read correctly. The dead would not be erased from the display. They would simply have moved on the polished wooden case that housed the goblets from the state of the living to the state of the remembered. The goblets travelled with the reunions. They were laid out at each gathering in a specific order, keyed to the crew numbers and the aircraft assignments of the raid, so that a man looking at the case could read the operation itself in the arrangement of the silver. At the centre of the case, from the earliest days of the ritual, sat a single sealed bottle of cognac. It was a bottle of Hennessy. Its vintage was 1896, the year of Jimmy Doolittle's birth. The choice of the vintage was deliberate. The bottle had been acquired specifically for the ritual, and its role was specific. It was to remain sealed for as long as more than 2 raiders were living. When only 2 remained, they would open the bottle together, pour from it into the 2 goblets whose engraving still stood upright, and drink a final toast to the 78 who had preceded them. The bottle, sitting sealed year after year at the centre of the case, was the terminal object of the ceremony, the punctuation mark toward which the entire ritual moved. The mechanics of the annual toast, as the tradition settled into its mature form, followed a strict sequence. The reunions were held in the spring, close to the 18th of April. The surviving raiders, those able to travel, gathered at the appointed city. There were public events, air show appearances, autograph signings, dinners with local dignitaries, presentations at schools. These were the outward face of the reunion. The private core of the meeting occurred at a separate ceremony, closed or semi-closed, in which the surviving raiders assembled around the goblet case with a small number of officiants and family members. A roll call was read. The name of each of the 80 was spoken in turn. For each name, the response indicated the state of that man's goblet, living, or, when the answer had changed since the previous year, deceased. When a name was read whose owner had died in the intervening months, the goblet was lifted from its position, turned over, and set back down. The upside-down engraving became the visible one. A toast followed, poured from a decanter of brandy, not the Hennessy which remained sealed, into the goblets of the living. The living drank. The dead were toasted in the goblets that could no longer be lifted. The ritual was, in its structure, a countdown. Every reunion by definition subtracted at least the possibility of some of the men. The case, examined from year to year, told the story of the operation's arithmetic without any need for a speech. In the early reunions of the 1950s and 1960s, the great majority of the goblets stood upright. As the men aged into their 60s and 70s and 80s, the balance shifted. By the late 1980s, the inverted goblets had become the majority. By the mid-1990s, the men who could still stand at the roll call formed a small cluster on one side of the case. The Hennessy bottle, unopened, remained where it had always been. The reunions had never been solely about the men themselves. They were, in the framing that Doolittle set and that his surviving crews maintained, about the operation as a whole, which meant about the 3 who had died in the immediate aftermath and the 4 who had died in Japanese custody, and in a formulation that some of the raiders were more willing to voice in old age than they had been when they were younger, about the Chinese villagers whose sacrifice was not commemorated by any goblet at all. In interviews given by individual raiders in the last decades of their lives, that Chinese dimension of the memory surfaces with increasing frequency. Men who had spent their working lives declining to speak about the raid in detail began, in their 70s and 80s, to speak about the farmers who had fed them, the fishermen who had rowed them out to sea, the priests who had hidden them, the children who had led them along mountain paths. Some of them spoke about what they knew, or had come to know, of the reprisals that had followed the rescues. Some of them said, in various forms, that they had lived their subsequent lives in the knowledge of a debt they could not repay. The debt was on the men's minds. It was on Doolittle's mind in the compressed and disciplined way that mattered on his mind. It was not, however, yet on the memorial map of the 2 countries whose histories the raid had joined. In the Chinese provinces where the reprisals had fallen, the villages that had lost their people carried the knowledge in local memory and in the private accounts of families. In the United States, the goblet case travelled from reunion to reunion, and the country that had made a legend of the raid made no corresponding legend of what the raid had cost the countryside on the far side of the ocean. The 2 memories ran in parallel, unjoined, for decades. It would take until the 2nd decade of the 21st century for a physical structure to be built in China that acknowledged, in a form the 2 countries could share, what the villagers of Zhejiang had done and what had been done to them for doing it. That structure, when it came, arrived very late. Later than the lives of nearly all the raiders it commemorated the rescue of, and later than the lives of nearly all the villagers whose descendants it invited to remember. The building that finally opened in Cuzhou, in the eastern province of Zhejiang, opened in 2018. 76 years had passed since the spring in which the raiders had come down out of the weather onto its terraced fields and its river valleys. 5 years had passed since the last public toast in Ohio. Most of the men whose rescue the museum commemorated were dead. Most of the villagers whose actions the museum honoured were dead as well, and had been dead for a long time. What the museum recorded, therefore, was not living testimony, but the transferred memory of children and grandchildren, the folded documents in family drawers, the photographs that had survived the reprisals and the famines and the long political weather of the intervening decades. Cuzhou had been at the centre of the rescue network in the days after April 18, 1942. It was one of the cities toward which the crews had been briefed to fly, one of the fields that had failed to light, one of the districts in which airmen had come down in 1s and 2s and been passed from hand to hand along the improvised chain that carried them out of Japanese reach. It had also been at the centre of what came afterward. When the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign moved into the countryside in the summer of 1942, it moved through Cuzhou. The airfields were the primary military object. The villages were the object of a different kind of policy. What the campaign left in the province, the burned settlements, the poisoned wells, the flooded rice paddies, the outbreaks of plague and cholera and typhoid that continued to kill after the troops had withdrawn, was a landscape whose scars long outlasted the war that had produced them. For decades after the war, the memory of the rescues was carried in Cuzhou primarily inside households. The reasons were partly the ordinary reasons of grief and partly the particular reasons of a country whose political weather changed several times in the years after 1945. The families that had helped the Americans had done so under one government and had lived afterward under another. The nationalist officers and guerrillas who had coordinated portions of the rescue network were, in the framing of the People's Republic that emerged in 1949, not obvious candidates for public celebration. The Americans whose lives had been saved were, in the framing of the Cold War that followed, not obvious candidates either. The result, across the second half of the 20th century, was a memory that lived in the villages and in the family stories but that seldom entered the official record. A farmer who had hidden an airman under a pile of straw in April 1942 might, in his later years, tell his grandchildren about it in the evening. He would seldom be asked to tell it to anyone else. The physical traces persisted in the meantime. In the countryside around Cuzhou, the villages that had been destroyed had been rebuilt on the same ground, and older residents remembered which houses had stood where before the fires. The graves of civilians killed in the reprisals sat in family plots and in hillside groves, marked by stones that carried names and, in some cases, the year 1942. In certain villages there were structures, a courtyard, a schoolroom, a small chapel, where airmen had been hidden, and where the local memory of the hiding had been kept as a matter of course. Occasionally, in the post-war decades, an American researcher or a Chinese local historian passed through and heard some of these accounts and wrote them down. The record built slowly and unofficially in fragments, in a language and in venues that seldom reached the American public. What changed in the 21st century was, in part, a matter of generations. The grandchildren of the villagers who had performed the rescues began to reach the age at which family stories become the object of research. The Chinese scholarship on the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, on the biological warfare component of it, on the specific decisions made in specific villages in the days after April 18th, moved from the margins toward the centre of the country's wartime historiography. Municipal and provincial authorities began to see the story of the rescues and of what had been done to the rescuers as a legitimate object of public commemoration. Contacts developed between the descendants of the Chinese rescuers and the last of the raiders and their families. Delegations travelled in both directions. Photographs from the visits show elderly Americans and elderly Chinese standing together on the terraces where, 7 decades earlier, one group had come down out of the sky and the other had made, in an afternoon or a night, the decision to hide them. The museum that opened in Cuzhou in 2018 was the physical culmination of that slow accumulation. It stood in the district whose villages had absorbed the largest single share of the rescues. Its exhibits gathered together the artifacts and the accounts that had been dispersed across households and archives. A bailout canopy, a piece of an aircraft, a photograph of a family that had sheltered a specific crew, a document listing the names of villagers killed in the reprisals of that summer. The names ran on for a long time. The building, in its architecture and its labels, joined two things that in the American public memory had almost always been kept apart: the operation itself and the price paid by the countryside where the operation ended. To walk through the museum was to encounter, in a single continuous narrative, the takeoff from the Hornet, the strike on Tokyo, the crash landings in the valleys of Zhejiang, and the summer of 1942, in which the villages that had absorbed the airmen were subjected to a campaign designed to make the absorption a lesson. The estimated 250,000 Chinese civilian dead were not a footnote to the exhibit. They were the point at which its two halves met. The opening was attended by descendants of villagers who had participated in the rescue network and by American representatives connected to the raiders' legacy. Speeches were given, wreaths were laid. The event was covered in the Chinese press and more thinly in the American press. The museum's opening did not remake either country's public memory of the raid at a stroke. It did not undo the 76 years in which the Chinese cost of the operation had gone largely unspoken in the country whose airmen had been rescued. It did establish, however, a physical structure in the ground of the province where the rescues had happened, a place where the two halves of the story could be seen together. It was a very late arrival for such a place. The men whose rescue it commemorated were, with one exception, no longer alive to walk through it. That one exception, by 2018, was Richard Cole. He was 102 years old and living in Texas. He had outlived his commander by more than 3 decades, his fellow crew members by many decades, and by then all 79 of the men who had stood with him on the deck of the Hornet on the morning of April 18th, 1942. He was the man who had sat in the right-hand seat of the lead aircraft that morning, watching Doolittle's hands on the controls, watching the flight deck fall away, watching the coast of Japan rise up in the noon light, and the target run unfold beneath the nose. Every image the country had of the raid at its origin included, at the edge of the frame, the young man who was now the last man alive who'd been inside it. Before Cole, there had been the 4 who stood at the museum in Dayton on November 9th, 2013 for the final public toast. By that date, the goblet case had already reached a condition its designers had known would eventually come. Of the 80 engraved cups, 76 stood upside down. 4 still stood upright. Dick Cole was one of them. Edward Saylor, who had been an engineer gunner on Crew 15 in April 1942, and who was now 83 years past his own bailout into China, was another. Robert Haight, who had been one of the 8 captured in 1942 and had come out of Japanese prisons in August 1945 with his weight nearly halved and had rebuilt himself in the decades afterward, was the third. David Thatcher, who had been the gunner on Crew 7 and had helped keep his badly injured crewmates alive in the days after their ditching in the surf, was the fourth. The 4 men were, by then, in their 90s. They arrived at the museum in wheelchairs and with the assistance of family members. They were seated at a long table with the goblet case behind them. The room was full. Cameras were arrayed in rows. The bottle that was brought out and placed on the table had been sealed since the 1950s. It was a bottle of Hennessy cognac from 1896, the year of James Doolittle's birth. It had travelled with the goblet case from reunion to reunion for more than half a century, and had never been opened. The premise on which it had been reserved, that its final consumption would fall to the last 2 surviving raiders in a private toast to the whole company, had over the years been modified by the men themselves. The 4 remaining raiders had decided, sometime before the November ceremony, that the private toast would become a public one, and that it would be held while enough of them still stood upright to perform it together rather than deferred to a moment when it might no longer be possible to perform at all. The decision was pragmatic. It was also generous, in a way characteristic of the men who made it. The public would be permitted to watch a rite that had been designed as a small and interior thing. The bottle was uncorked in front of the cameras. The 4 goblets that still stood upright were lifted from the case and set on the table. Cole, Saylor, Haight and Thatcher seated held their goblets while the cognac was poured. The pour was small. The Hennessy that had been sealed in a bottle since before any of them had been born was, for the first time in more than a century, in contact with the air of a room. A short set of remarks was offered. Names were read. The names of the men whose goblets stood inverted behind them were read, one after another, until the roll was complete. The 4 men lifted their goblets. They drank. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Its meaning, however, was not measured in seconds. What was completed in the room was the ritual that Doolittle and his men had constructed to carry the operation forward into a time after the operation itself had ended, and to carry the men who had performed it forward into a time after most of the men had ended. The ritual had been built to answer a specific question. What do you do after the war is over, and the medals are pinned and the years pass, with the fact of having been 80 men who did a particular thing on a particular morning? And the answer it had given for more than 60 years was, you meet every year, you read the names, you turn the cups. The uncorking of the Hennessy was the ritual's terminal act. There was no further step in the sequence. Everything that had been designed to be done had, at that table on November 9, 2013, been done. The footage from that afternoon shows 4 very old men performing a rite that has almost outlived its participants. What is striking in the footage, watched now, is the ordinariness of the 4 men's manner. There is no visible drama. There is a quiet performance of long-standing routine, adjusted for the fact that most of the routine's participants are no longer able to be present. The men speak clearly. Their hands are steady on the goblets. They do what the ritual requires. When they have done it, they set the goblets back down. The bottle is recorked, though what remains in it is now a fraction of what it contained at the start of the afternoon, and though the fiction of its perpetual reserve is, at this point, over. Saylor died in early 2015. Thatcher died in mid-2016. Haight died in early 2015 as well. The 3 men who had stood the final toast with Cole in November 2013 were, within roughly 2.5 years of that afternoon, gone. Their goblets were turned in their absence, in the small ceremonies that had become the ritual's ordinary form in the years when the surviving cluster had been reduced almost to nothing. By early 2016, of the 80 goblets in the case, 79 stood upside down. 1 still stood upright. It carried, engraved twice, the name of Richard E. Cole. He lived in that condition for 3 more years. He was by then a widely recognised figure in the small world that attended to the raid's memory. He gave interviews, he attended events, he travelled in his late 90s and past 100 to places where the raid was commemorated. He spoke about the operation in the plain, deflecting language he had used all his life. He said in one variation or another that the 80 of them had been young men who had trained for a mission and had gone and done it. He resisted, gently and consistently, the framings that placed him at the centre of a legend. He acknowledged, when asked, the Chinese civilians whose sacrifice had made his own survival possible. He was aware, as the last of the men who had come down into those hills, that his own memory carried the weight of a debt he could not personally discharge. He died on April 9, 2019 in San Antonio, Texas, at the age of 103. 9 days later, the 77th anniversary of the raid passed. The goblet that carried his name was, by long-established practice, the subject of the ritual that had been performed 79 times before it. The formal turning of that final goblet was, however, held back. The decision was made to defer the last act of the ritual to a date that would place it on a specific anniversary, and to place it in the presence of Cole's family. In April 2022, on the 80th anniversary of the raid, at Northwest Florida State College in the Florida Panhandle, Cole's children performed the turning of his goblet. The engraved cup was lifted, inverted, and set back down. The upside-down engraving of the name of Richard E. Cole became the visible one. The 80 cups in the case, from that moment forward, all stood the same way. The case, as it now sits, is a completed object. Its two states, the state in which any goblet stood upright and the state in which any goblet had been turned, have both passed. There is only the final configuration. The rite that governed the transition from the first state to the last has ended because the population it governed has ended. The bottle of 1896 Hennessy that sat sealed on the shelf for the greater part of a century has been opened. What remains of it is a partial bottle, its cork replaced, its contents an artifact rather than a reserve. The room in Dayton in which the case is displayed receives the visitors that a museum receives: schoolchildren, veterans, tourists, family members. The case does not require explanation to those who know what it is. To those who do not, the labels supply the outline. The outline, however, is only the American half of the story that the outline records. The other half is in Cuzhou, in the museum that opened in 2018, and in the villages of the province whose fields absorbed the airmen in April 1942 and whose people were made to answer for the absorption in the months that followed. It is in the family graves on the hillsides. It is in the names running down the walls of the exhibit of the civilians who were killed in the reprisals. It is in the oral accounts of grandchildren who now stand, in some cases, on the ground where a grandparent's decision to hide a stranger cost the grandparent's own life, or the life of a neighbour, or the life of an entire settlement. The two halves of the story exist at this point in physical form in both countries. They are not, however, yet joined in the popular memory of the country whose airmen were saved. The elaborate American ritual, with its silver goblets and its century-old bottle and its ceremony inside a National Museum, remains widely known. The Chinese cost, whose numeric shape approaches 250,000 dead, remains, in the version of the raid that most Americans learn, either absent or reduced to a passing phrase. The Cuzhou Museum is a crack in that silence. It is not yet a chorus. What the raid was, in the end, is what it always was: a mission flown by 80 men on a single morning in April 1942, in aircraft that could not return to the ship they had come from, at a moment when the country that sent them needed to demonstrate to itself and to its enemy that the war was not going to be conducted only on terms the enemy had chosen. The mission achieved that demonstration. It also produced, as its unadvertised consequence, a sequence of events on the Chinese coast that killed vastly more people than the raid itself killed in Japan. Both facts belong to the operation. Neither can be subtracted without falsifying it. The goblet case in Dayton, with its 80 inverted cups, records the first fact. The museum in Cuzhou, with its wall of civilian names, records the second. It has taken the better part of a century for both records to exist. It will take longer for both to be read together. Dick Cole, in the interviews he gave in the last years of his life, was often asked what he thought the raid meant. He answered, in various forms, that he was not the person to say. He said that the men had trained and had done what they had been trained to do. He said that a great many people in a great many places had done a great deal to make the survival of the crews possible. He said, when the subject came up, that he was aware of what had happened in China afterward, and that he thought about it. He did not offer conclusions. He offered instead the small and consistent gestures of a man who had lived a long time inside a memory he considered larger than himself. The bottle is on the shelf. The 80 cups are turned. The 4 men who lifted their goblets in Dayton in November 2013 are gone. The one who outlived them is gone. The villagers who fed and hid and rowed and guided the 69 men out of Japanese reach in the spring of 1942 are gone, and the many more who paid for that hospitality in the summer that followed are gone as well. What remains is the case, and the museum on the other side of the ocean, and the arithmetic they contain between them. 16 aircraft, 80 men, 3 killed at the outset, 8 captured, 3 executed, 1 dead in a Shanghai cell, 69 carried out through the hills, 250,000 buried where they fell. The numbers do not by themselves compose a memory. A country decides what it will remember. 2 countries, in this case, decided differently, and for a long time. The last goblet has been turned, the debt has not.